everyone, this is Warhawk Beyond 2040 and welcome to a very special edition of the Progressive Rock and Metal Album Review Series. And today I'm going to be taking a look at the legendary catalogue from one of the greatest, most iconic and legendary bands in the history of music, the one and only legendary rock band Rush. And this is part three of a five-part special where I am going to be taking a look at each decade of Rush's albums. And this is a follow-up to the last one that I did where I discussed all of Rush's albums from the 80s. So for today's edition, which is part three, I am going to be taking a look at Rush's albums from the 90s. So the 80s was a very unique and interesting period for Rush. They kicked off the 80s with a bang by releasing two very successful albums, Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures, both albums which would help cement Rush as one of the greatest bands of all time and also gave them huge exposure on a worldwide scale as their popularity absolutely exploded. But rather than being content to continue the formula that they began with Moving Pictures, Rush decided to go in a different direction as they would slowly start to move away from the progressive rock style of music as they would start to dabble into elements of reggae and new wave as the band would start to incorporate more electronics to their repertoire. Geddy Lee would start to incorporate more and more keyboards. Neil Peart would dabble into the electronic drum kit, and Alex Lifeson, whose position as a guitar player would see his guitar playing virtually take a back seat as he would concentrate more on textural and chordal soundscapes instead of the burning, shredding guitar sound that he displayed back in the 70s. And depending on who you really ask, some fans stayed away from Rush, but also Rush maintained a very loyal fan base. But as the band moved forward into the 90s, they would experience another transitional time, and of course, it would ultimately lead to a very dark period in the band's history involving one member of the band. So, as we moved into the 90s, change was in the air. Grunge was starting to become more of a thing. Hip hop would start to become more of a thing. But Rush, to their credit, soldiered on and continued to make and produce some great albums as the band would start to move more away from the keyboard driven style of music as they would opt to go back to their roots in a more guitar oriented direction, but just in a more modern take. So, as always, I'm going to be taking a look at Rush's albums from the 90s, and as always, I will choose which one I think is the best one. Now, compared to the 80s and the 70s, Rush put out a lot of albums, but for the 90s, we have only three albums to show, and there's a very good reason for that. But all three albums, they're all different, still Rush, but as I said, not quite the same as they were in the 80s or 70s. Rush, as I said before, they are the ultimate musical chameleons. They know how to adapt to the times and they are always constantly redefining their sounds and always keeping things fresh. So we're going to start with the first one, which came out in 1991, and this is a very personal favourite of mine, Roll the Bones. So Roll the Bones pretty much carries on from 1989's Presto. Presto was still very much Rush, but it was a lot more laid back, but you still had a lot of hard and heaviness in their music, but it was certainly a lot more laid back compared to some of the other albums that they released in the 80s. With Roll the Bones, they still continue that trend, but they now start to embrace more and more of the hard rock nature. And for me, I think Roll the Bones is an excellent album. There's still keyboards in their music, but not quite as prominent as some of their 80s recordings. But to me, I think this is a tremendous album and got a lot of my favourite songs on here as well. Music is, as always, written and composed by Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson, and lyrics, of course, provided by Neil Peart. So let's have a look, shall we? There's the cover, and there's the floating wishbones that you get from the turkey. So there's the lyrics. And there's some more lyrics here as well. There they are. Looking very, very fashionable for the 90s. Nice. There's more lyrics. And more lyrics as well. So, you know, for the 90s, it's quite interesting because the 90s musically, everything was changing depending on who you really ask. I don't think the 90s, you know, was the greatest of times musically. You know, there was a lot of things that weren't that great, but depending on what you listen to, really, there was still some good stuff coming out. And Roll the Bones was no exception. This was a very exceptional album and a great way to kick off the 90s for the band. So we got the first track, Dreamline, which is a great opener. I think, you know, it's a really good track. I think it's a great way to kick off this album. And there's a really cool lyric in there that Geddy Lee sings. It goes, "We're only immortal for a limited time." So I think that's a very powerful line, and you know, really emotional in Neil Peart's lyrics. So I think that really tugs on the heartstrings when you listen to it very closely. Bravado is another great track. The title track, Roll the Bones, is absolutely brilliant, and there's a very hilarious section where you have a rap, you know, Jack, relax, get busy with the facts. So, you know, it's cool to hear that Rush have a sense of humour, that they can be funny as well, even in their music. So that's quite entertaining to hear that. Then we got Face Up, which is another great track. Then we got the instrumental Where's My Thing, Part 4, Gangster of Boats Trilogy. I'm sure there's a gag in there somewhere, but it's a really good track. The Big Wheel, another great track as well. Hearsay, another great track. Ghost of a Chance, absolutely beautiful with some great haunting guitar playing from Alex Lifeson, great soulful vocals from Geddy Lee and Neil Peart. What more can you say, really? His drumming is just pure perfection. Neurotica, another great track, and You Bet Your Life, another great track. I think all of the songs from top to bottom on Roll the Bones is very, very strong. And Geddy Lee, his vocals, as you get to the 90s, he's got a much more calmer in his range. He's not going for the screeching sounds that he was displaying in the 70s. I think when you get to the 90s, he kind of like reached a very nice balance in his vocals. Obviously, he's still got the wailing vocals that we all know, but he opts for a much more laid back approach in his singing, and it's really good, you know. And I think he kind of started that around the mid 80s, but I think by the 90s he definitely reached a balance, and it's really good. It's very pleasing to the ears. Alex Lifeson, his guitar playing all over this album, back to having a huge presence once again, which, you know, I always felt that some of the albums in the 80s, he still had some great guitar licks and some great shredding, but I kind of feel on some of the 80s albums, his guitar playing was kind of toned down a lot in the mix. You could still hear him, but he wasn't as prominent as compared to like the 70s. So it's great to see Alex Lifeson back, burning it up. Neil Peart going more for a traditional drumming type of sound. You can still hear some of the electronic drums in his playing, but it's not as prominent as some of the 80s albums. But he sounds absolutely fantastic. In fact, I think all the guys on here sound amazing on this album, and the production is absolutely top notch. And it's a very good album, and it sounds very fresh. So standout tracks for me are Dreamline, Roll the Bones, Face Up, Where's My Thing, The Big Wheel, and Ghost of a Chance. I think that's a really good, lovely song. But the whole album, Roll the Bones, excellent. I think it's a really good album, very strong. Probably a little bit more stronger than 1989's Presto, but not saying that Presto was bad. It was still good, but maybe just a tad bit laid back. But here, Rush back with a vengeance, kicking the door down and kicking off the 90s as only Rush can with a tremendous album. So there you have it. Roll the Bones, a great way to kick off the 90s for one of the greatest bands of all time. Excellent stuff. So we move on to the next album, which came out in 1993, and this one is called Counterparts. So, as I mentioned already, the 90s was clearly all about changing. Grunge was becoming more popular, hip hop was starting to get more mainstream exposure. But with a band like Rush, who have been around since the 70s, they have always reinvented themselves and always constantly redefining their sound and never staying in the same place and repeating themselves. And they've always been able to adapt and thrive in any situation you put them in, and they know how to move with the times. So, with Counterparts, this album, I would say, is probably the darkest and heaviest album that they have ever put out. Probably a lot more heavier than their 70s catalogue. But, you know, you can hear like influences of all of the different grunge bands, but it still sounds very much like Rush. And I always refer to this album as Rush's darkest album, so you could definitely hear like more raspier vocals and heavier guitar playing, and the production is very fuzzy and very dirty. It's really got that menacing feel to it, and I think it's a really good album. It's a testament to Rush's ability that they can thrive in any situation you put them in. And Geddy Lee's got dirty bass playing going on. Alex Lifeson, he's just an absolute beast on the guitars with some of the most extreme guitar playing he's ever put out. And Neil Peart, he's just a badass on the drums. Some hard hitting drumming. And the music overall on Counterparts really packs a hell of a punch. And I think this is, as far as musical performance is concerned, is probably one of Rush's best for the 90s. I think they sound really good here. So let's have a look, shall we? So there you are. All these different pictures here. And there is the chaps. Here we go, look at that. There's all the lyrics and all the different themes with the pictures that convey what's going on with the songs. But yeah, it's a really good, strong album, I think. And I think with Counterparts, I don't think it's one to be ignored. I think with Counterparts, it's one of those albums you got to really listen to it all the way through and appreciate it for what it really is. But it really shows that Rush ain't afraid to get down and dirty when they need to. So, as always, music is written and composed by Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson, and lyrics provided by Neil Peart. So, we got Animate, great opener. Stick It Out, probably the darkest track Rush have ever recorded. Cut to the Chase, it's a great song, quite an underrated one actually. Nobody's Hero, very emotional and very powerful with great acoustic strumming guitar playing from Alex Lifeson. Between Sun and Moon, another great song. Alien Shore, another great song as well. The Speed of Love, really good track. Double Agents a really good track as well. Leave That Thing Alone is a nice instrumental with some great hard hitting playing from all the guys. Cold Fire, another great song, and Everyday Glory, another great song. But I think overall, this album from top to bottom is remarkably strong and certainly equally as good as Roll the Bones. And as I said, Rush aren't afraid to get heavy when they need to. In fact, you could say that Rush were one of the first bands to do all the heavy stuff long before these grunge bands were even in nappies. So props to Rush to showing the kids out there this is how you make a heavy album. And boy, it is heavy indeed, but also mellow at the same time in some spots, but still very much Rush, but just different, but more for the 90s and a more modern take. So they pretty much continue the guitar driven direction that they started a couple of albums back after starting to move away from the keyboards. So standout tracks to me are Animate, Stick It Out, Nobody's Hero, and Leave That Thing Alone. But a very good, strong album from start to finish. Geddy Lee sounds amazing, both vocally and musically. Great drumming from Neil Peart and unbelievable guitar playing from Alex Lifeson. So there you have it. Counterparts. Excellent album and certainly the heaviest album in their catalogue and certainly the heaviest album they ever put out for the 90s. Tremendous stuff. So we move on to the next album, which came out in 1996, and this one is called Test for Echo. So, Test for Echo would mark the final album that Rush would put out for the 90s, and this would be the last new album that Rush would record for the next 5 years. And there is a very good reason for that, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, Test for Echo was a Rush album that I never really listened to that much. In fact, out of their entire catalogue, this was one that I never really reached for that much. It's not because I didn't like it or I disliked it. It was just one of those albums that just kind of went by me and I never really took a lot of notice of it. But I sat down and listened to all of it and I thought to myself, wow, this is actually pretty good. There's some really good stuff here. And I think this album kind of gets overlooked in the 90s catalogue of Rush compared to Counterparts and Roll the Bones. They get talked about probably just a little bit more, but I think Test for Echo is not really an album you should overlook. I think there's some great material on here, and Rush was still adapting to the 90s as they completely moved away from the keyboards side of things, but they still kept some keyboards in their sound, but it wasn't as prominent. But I think there's some very good, strong writing and some powerful lyrics from the guys. And I think Test for Echo, it's a good album. But I think it's one of those albums you got to really listen to it all the way through and really learn to appreciate it. And as time has gone on, the more I listen to Test for Echo, the more I think to myself, you know what, this actually isn't that bad. This actually is really good. So let's have a look, shall we? So there is the album cover. That's quite a cool picture, actually. So there we are. There's the track listing and the guys who are credited. That's a really cool picture, actually. I have to say, the artwork for Test for Echo is really good. Certainly different to the artwork we've seen from the past with Rush and their albums. There's some more lyrics here. Some more lyrics here as well. And there's some more as well. That's actually a really cool picture. I like that. And there's some more. There's actually, if you look closely, there's a picture of Rush when they were kids. I think that's a really nice picture. And there's some more as well. Some more lyrics and some more cool artwork. That's a really cool shot as well. Some more lyrics as well. And then we've got the production notes and a nice cool shot, no pun intended, of some snowmen. But yeah, I think Test for Echo, I don't think it gets enough love that it should. I'm not saying that this album got panned or anything, but I just don't think it got as much love at the time. I think when you look back at it now, it's actually a really good album. There's some great tracks on here as well. So we've got Test for Echo, which kicks things off. It's a classic Rush track, a bit more heavy. It's pretty much carried on the heaviness from Counterparts, but it's a little bit more lighter in some parts. We've got Driven, another great song as well. Half the World, great song as well. The Color of Right, great track. Time and Motion, another good song as well. Totem's a great track as well. Dog Years, it's actually one of my favourites on this album. It's a really good track. Virtuality, it's a great song as well. Resist is absolutely gorgeous, and Geddy and Alex actually play this together as a duet live on acoustic guitars. It's just absolutely lovely. Limbo is a great track as well, which kind of like sums up what would happen to Rush after this album, which we'll talk about in a moment. And Carve Away the Stone, another great song as well. There's some really good, strong material on this album. I think. I think the some of the songs in here I think are Rush classics. And as I said, I think this album shouldn't be ignored in their catalogue. I think this is definitely one to check out, and I think this is one you should look at if you want to get into Rush's 90s portion of music. So standout tracks for me are Test for Echo, Driven, Dog Years, Half the World, and Resist. But I think the whole album from top to bottom is incredibly strong and definitely shows that Rush are still very much at the top of their game and still had a lot of gas in their tank and plenty to say as far as the 90s was concerned. So there you have it. Test for Echo, excellent album, and sadly, this will be the last album that Rush would put out for the 90s. And as I said, there is a very good reason why that was the case. So there you have it. Test for Echo. Excellent stuff. So, which Rush album from the 90s do I think is the best one? Well, I think Test for Echo is probably the most underrated album of the 90s catalogue, and I think it's definitely one to check out because there's some great material on there. Counterparts, I think, is a very dark and heavy album. I think it had some really good stuff and some great playing from the guys. But if I had to choose, I think I would have to go with Roll the Bones as the best Rush album of the 90s. I think it's a very strong album. It kicked things off in a big way for Rush as they went straight into the 90s. And it pretty much continued the trend that they started with Presto, but they just opted to go in a different direction and take things to the next level. And it's got a lot of my favourite songs on Roll the Bones: Dreamline, Bravado, the title track Face Up, Where's My Thing, The Big Wheel, Hearsay, and Ghost of a Chance, which is just absolutely gorgeous. But I think the whole album, Roll the Bones, is an excellent album and certainly the best one they've ever put out for the 90s. Counterparts and Test for Echo, they're definitely up there, but just different. But I don't think you can go wrong with any of these albums as far as 90s Rush is concerned. I think they're all good. They've all got their own identity. They're very much their own beast, but I like them. I like them all. But for me, Roll the Bones is the best one as far as the 90s Rush is concerned. I think it's a fantastic album. Great guitar playing from Alex Lifeson, great bass work from Geddy Lee, great vocals as well, and great drumming from Neil Peart. I think the whole album really showed everyone that Rush are still kicking ass and still got plenty of gas in the tank. And the same goes for the other two as well. This is definitely showcasing a band that refuses to stand still and they won't be buried and they won't let the changes affect them in any way. Okay, you want us to change? We won't change for you. We'll change how we want, but we're going to do things our way. And they definitely do things their way with these three albums. So there you have it. Rush, Roll the Bones, my all-time favourites from the 90s and their best one for the 90s. Excellent stuff. So after Test for Echo, Rush would pretty much go into hiatus for the next 5 years as Neil Peart would experience tragedy in his life with the passing of his wife and his daughter. And Rush would pretty much go on a sabbatical, and it looked like things were over for the band. And Geddy Lee would release his first solo album in the 2000s, My Favorite Headache. Alex Lifeson would release his own album called Victor, which, by the way, is a really kick ass album. But it looked like, for all intents and purposes, Rush were pretty much finished. And there was no news about whether or not they were going to come back. And things looked pretty bleak for, such an iconic band. But Rush would return in the new millennium with a vengeance and basically begin a whole new second run for themselves. But that's going to be saved for part 4 of this 5-part Rush special. And we'll talk about the 2000s Rush albums. So that's going to be it from me. I'm going to wrap this up now. What's your favourite Rush album from the 90s? Is it Roll the Bones? Is it Counterparts? Or Test for Echo? There's no right or wrong answer. We all have our favourite albums. You know what to do, guys. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your thoughts and comments down below, and I will see all of you next time for another edition of the Progressive Rock and Metal album review series, where I am going to be taking a look at the Rush 2000s albums. So make sure you don't miss that. So until then, take care, everybody, and stay safe. And once again, as always, much appreciated. Thanks for listening.